True War Encounters, Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used Johnson M1941 in 1942 with adaptive resolve to cover a withdrawal, rare account. The Johnson M1941 felt all wrong in Jake McNiece's hands. It was June 8, 1944, somewhere in the Normandy hedgerows west of Sainte-Mère-Église, and McNiece was crouched behind a collapsed stone wall with a rifle he'd never trained on, watching 18 paratroopers scramble through the mud toward a tree line 200 yards away. The rifle was heavier than the M1 Garand, the rotary magazine bulkier and unfamiliar, but it was the only weapon within reach when the German MG-42 opened up from across the field. McNiece had grabbed it from a misdropped supply crate 2 days earlier, equipment meant for Marine reconnaissance units, blown into a ditch during the chaos of D-Day. And now he was about to find out if 10 rounds and a faster cycling action could buy his men enough time to reach cover. The hedgerows around him were thick with the smell of wet earth and cordite. 48 hours after the jump, nothing had gone according to plan. McNiece's stick had landed 3 miles off target, scattered across flooded pastures and burning glider wreckage. The equipment bundles were lost, blown into canals or buried in craters, and the filthy 13 had spent 2 days scrounging ammunition, rations and weapons from the dead. Most paratroopers would have ignored the Johnson rifle, too unconventional and untested for frontline combat, but McNiece had been intrigued by the promise of 2 extra rounds per magazine and semi-automatic fire that might make a difference when every second counted. Now, with German voices shouting orders across the field and boots splashing through water somewhere to his left, he was betting his life and the lives of 18 men on that gamble. Lieutenant Hendricks had gone down with shrapnel in his leg, screaming for a medic, and the retreat had turned into a rout. Paratroopers bolted for the tree line, leaving equipment scattered in the mud, and McNiece knew that if someone didn't anchor the rear, the Germans would overrun them in minutes. He stayed behind, not because of orders, but because McNiece understood the brutal arithmetic of withdrawal under fire. Someone had to suppress the German advance, force them to take cover, buy the squad 30 seconds to reach the hedgerow and regroup. The Johnson rifle, with its 10-round magazine and smooth cycling action, gave him a marginal edge over a bolt-action Kar 98K. He could fire faster, reload quicker than the Garand's en-bloc clip system, and keep the Germans' heads down long enough for his men to escape. But the rifle was unfamiliar, the sights slightly off, and McNiece had never trained with it. Every round counted, and every second he stayed exposed brought him closer to a German bullet. Behind him, Sergeant Mapes was screaming his name, waving him toward the tree line. McNiece could see the Germans advancing through the hedge, grey uniforms moving with discipline and purpose, and he raised the Johnson, feeling the unfamiliar weight settle against his shoulder. The first burst surprised him with its smoothness. 3 rounds, controlled, punching into the edge of the German position. Movement in the trees, shouting. He squeezed off another burst, the rotary magazine clicking smoothly, feeding rounds without jamming. The MG-42 went silent for 3 precious seconds, long enough for 2 paratroopers to drag Hendricks into cover, and then resumed, chewing through the stone wall and forcing McNiece to roll behind a burned-out farm cart. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Part 2. The mission had been simple on paper. Link up with scattered elements of the 506th PIR, secure a crossroads west of Carentan, and prepare for the push inland. But the chaos of the D-Day jump had shattered any sense of order. Officers were missing, maps were wrong, radios were dead. McNiece had found himself leading a makeshift squad of 18 paratroopers, some from the filthy 13, others from units he didn't recognize, through enemy territory with no clear objective except survival. Private Kowalski, a replacement who'd frozen during his first firefight the day before, was now moving through the hedgerow with surprising steadiness, helping the wounded Hendricks while keeping low. McNiece had noticed the change. Combat had a way of burning away everything except what mattered, but there was no time to dwell on it. The Germans were flanking left, trying to pin him down, while the MG-42 kept him suppressed. He could hear boots splashing through water, voices coordinating an assault in clipped German. McNiece had burned through 4 magazines, 40 rounds, and his ammunition pouch held only 2 more. The Johnson's barrel was heating up, the stock slick with sweat and mud. He knew he had seconds before they overran his position. The squad had ambushed a German supply convoy at dawn, seized ammunition and medical supplies, and were moving west when the patrol caught them in open ground. The hedgerows offered cover, but the Germans were closing fast, and the only route of withdrawal was a narrow farm lane choked with mud and barbed wire. Lieutenant Hendricks, a young officer from another company, had ordered a fighting retreat, staggered pullback, covering fire, leapfrog maneuvers, but the squad was exhausted, low on ammunition, and terrified. Half of them were replacements who had never fired a shot in combat before Normandy. When the MG-42 opened up, punching holes through the hedge and sending dirt spraying across the lane, 3 men froze in the open. That was when McNiece made his choice. He could follow doctrine, pull back with the others, maintain cohesion, hope everyone made it to the tree line. Or he could stay behind and force the Germans to deal with sustained fire from an unexpected position, buying precious seconds for his men to escape. The Johnson rifle made the choice seem almost logical. 10 rounds instead of 8, semi-automatic fire instead of bolt-action delays. A scavenged weapon that nobody expected him to have. Sergeant Mapes understood immediately. He'd served with McNiece long enough to recognize the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he settled into position like a man who'd already made peace with the cost. Mapes didn't argue. He just grabbed 2 paratroopers and started hauling Hendricks toward the tree line, trusting McNiece to do what he always did, improvise something impossible and somehow survive. McNiece fired his last full magazine in controlled 3-round bursts, each one aimed at movement, muzzle flash, or the sound of boots. The Johnson cycled smoothly, the recoil manageable, the semi-automatic fire giving him a psychological edge over the slower German rifles. But when the magazine clicked empty, McNiece had nothing left except a discarded M1 Garand half buried in the mud. He grabbed it, checked the chamber, 3 rounds, and fired blindly toward the German position. Then he ran. Part 3. McNiece hit the tree line at a dead sprint, lungs burning, legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Mapes grabbed him by the harness, dragging him into cover as German fire ripped through the branches overhead. The squad was scattered but intact. 18 men, all accounted for, Hendricks bleeding but stable. The Germans held their position at the hedgerow, unwilling to advance into the unknown, and the paratroopers used the reprieve to disappear into the Norman countryside. 3 hours later, McNiece sat in a ruined barn, the Johnson M1941 propped against the wall beside him. The rifle was scratched, mud-caked, and slightly bent from being dropped in the ditch, but it had worked when it mattered. His hands were still shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the aftershock of everything his body had been holding back while he was behind that wall. Private Kowalski brought him a canteen and sat down without asking permission. The kid had stopped looking at McNiece with the mixture of awe and resentment that replacements usually carried. Now there was just exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude. "You didn't have to stay," Kowalski said quietly. McNiece took a long drink before answering. Someone had to. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. McNiece had stayed because the alternative was watching his men die in the open, caught between the hedgerow and the German machine gun. He'd stayed because he knew the Johnson rifle gave him a chance. 10 rounds, faster fire, just enough of an edge. But he'd also stayed because some part of him couldn't walk away when men were depending on him, even if the smart play was to retreat and regroup. That stubbornness had earned him the nickname McNasty, and kept him in constant friction with officers who valued discipline over results, but it had also kept men alive. Sergeant Mapes joined them, sitting heavily against the barn wall. His uniform was filthy, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp. "Hendricks is going to make it," Mapes said. "Medic thinks he'll be evacuated to England, but he'll keep the leg." McNiece nodded. He didn't ask about the others. He'd already counted heads, noted who was limping, who was quiet, who was staring at nothing. "That rifle," Mapes continued, gesturing at the Johnson. "Where the hell did you even find it?" "Misdropped crate near Sainte-Mère-Église," McNiece said. "Marines were supposed to get it. Figured we needed it more." Mapes shook his head with something between admiration and exasperation. "You always figure, McNasty. Sometimes I don't know if you're brilliant or just too stubborn to die." McNiece didn't answer. He was thinking about the moment behind the stone wall when the Germans had started flanking, when he'd realized the Johnson only had 2 magazines left and the MG-42 was still chewing through his cover. He was thinking about how close he'd come to running out of ammunition, to being overrun, to becoming one more body the filthy 13 would have to account for. The official after-action report would describe the engagement as a successful tactical withdrawal under enemy pressure. Clean military language that sanitized the chaos into something presentable. But McNiece knew what it had really been. 18 terrified men scrambling through mud, while one stubborn NCO with a scavenged rifle bought them seconds they desperately needed. Would you follow the orders exactly? Or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. The next morning brought rain and rumors. Word filtered back through the scattered units of the 506th PIR that the Germans were pulling armor toward Carrington, preparing for a counter-attack against the Allied beachhead. The crossroads McNiece's squad had been ordered to secure was now behind enemy lines, the mission rendered meaningless by the chaos of the misdropped jump. Captain Morrison arrived at the barn just after dawn, a company commander trying to piece together what remained of his scattered platoons. He was tired, frustrated, and looking for someone to blame or praise. McNiece couldn't tell which. "Sergeant McNiece," Morrison said, his voice clipped. "Lieutenant Hendricks reported that you held a position under fire to cover the withdrawal. Is that accurate?" McNiece stood, feeling every bruise and strain from the previous day's fighting. "We were getting hit hard, sir. Somebody had to slow them down." Morrison studied him for a long moment. McNiece could see the calculation happening behind the officer's eyes. Recognition that the mission had succeeded despite breaking from standard doctrine, mixed with irritation that an NCO with McNiece's reputation for insubordination had once again improvised his way out of a disaster. "What were you firing?" Morrison asked, looking at the Johnson rifle. "That's not standard issue." "No, sir. Found it in a misdropped crate. Figured 10 rounds was better than 8 when you're alone against a German patrol." Morrison's jaw tightened. In another context, using non-standard equipment might have earned McNiece a reprimand. But with half the division scattered across Normandy and supply lines in chaos, improvisation wasn't just accepted, it was survival. "How many Germans?" Morrison asked. McNiece hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. He'd seen movement, muzzle flashes, heard voices coordinating. Could have been a squad, could have been more. "Enough to pin us down, sir. The MG-42 was the real problem. Had to keep them busy while the men moved." Morrison nodded slowly, filing away the information for a report that would eventually work its way up the chain of command. McNiece knew how these things worked. The messy reality would be compressed into clean sentences, his actions simplified into something that fit the narrative of heroic paratroopers holding against overwhelming odds. What the report wouldn't capture was the fear, the way his hands had shaken loading that last magazine, the certainty that he was about to die behind that stone wall, that the Germans would flank him before his men reached cover, that the Johnson rifle would jam or the ammunition would run out, and he'd be left with nothing but a bayonet and desperation. It wouldn't capture the moment when he'd grabbed that discarded Garand, 3 rounds left in the chamber. and fired blindly, just to make noise, to keep the Germans thinking there was still organized resistance, instead of one terrified NCO running on adrenaline and stubbornness. "You did good work, Sergeant," Morrison said finally. "I'm recommending you for a commendation." McNiece nodded, knowing the recommendation would probably disappear into the chaos of Normandy's aftermath, lost among thousands of similar reports from scattered units trying to account for their actions in those first brutal days after the jump. Morrison left, and McNiece sat back down. Kowalski was watching him with that same unreadable expression. "A commendation," the private said. "That mean anything to you?" McNiece looked at the Johnson rifle, remembering the weight of it, the unfamiliar trigger pull, the way it had cycled smoothly when everything else was falling apart. "Means somebody wrote it down," McNiece said quietly. "Doesn't change what happened." Part 5. That night, McNiece couldn't sleep. The barn was quiet except for the soft breathing of exhausted men and the distant rumble of artillery from Carrington. He sat with his back against the wall, the Johnson rifle across his lap, and let himself remember what he'd never tell Captain Morrison or anyone who asked about commendations and heroic stands. He remembered the panic, the moment behind that stone wall when he'd realized the Germans were flanking, when he'd counted his remaining ammunition and understood he had maybe 30 seconds before they overran his position. The moment when his hands had shaken so badly he'd almost dropped a magazine, when every instinct screamed at him to run, to follow the others to the tree line, to stop pretending he could hold off a German patrol alone with a rifle he barely knew how to operate. He'd stayed because running felt worse than dying, not out of courage, out of a stubborn inability to live with the image of his men cut down in the open while he saved himself. It wasn't heroism. It was the calculus of what he could bear to remember for the rest of his life. The Johnson rifle had saved him through sheer mechanical advantage, 10 rounds instead of 8, fast cycling that let him maintain suppressing fire just long enough to matter. But there had been a moment, loading that final magazine, with German voices getting closer, when he genuinely believed he was about to die. Not in some abstract warrior's sense, but in the immediate physical certainty that the next 30 seconds would end with him bleeding out in Norman mud, another misdropped paratrooper who'd gambled wrong. He'd fired that last magazine not with precision, but with desperate speed, emptying it in bursts aimed more at sound and intimidation than accuracy. And when it clicked empty, he'd experienced a moment of pure, crystalline terror, the knowledge that he was defenseless, that the Germans were still coming, that his improvisation had bought seconds but not survival. The discarded Garand had been pure luck. 3 rounds some other paratrooper had fired before dropping the rifle in panic or death. McNiece had grabbed it without thinking, fired blindly, and run, not in a tactical withdrawal, but in flat-out, terrified flight toward the tree line. Mapes had grabbed him at the edge of cover, and McNiece had nearly collapsed, legs shaking, lungs burning, the aftershock of adrenaline hitting him like a physical blow. He'd stood there gasping, watching the Germans hold their position, and realized with sick clarity how close he'd come to dying for a delay measured in seconds. That was the secret. That was what the after-action reports and commendation recommendations would never capture. Jake McNiece, the rebellious demolition NCO who'd held off a German patrol with adaptive resolve and a scavenged rifle, had been terrified. He'd stayed not because he was brave, but because he couldn't run. He'd fired not with calm precision, but with shaking hands and desperate hope. And he'd survived not through skill, but through the thin margin of mechanical advantage and pure, dumb luck. Across the barn, Sergeant Mapes stirred, opened his eyes, and looked at McNiece in the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Mapes asked quietly. McNiece shook his head. "Keep seeing that wall, the stone one, where I was pinned." Mapes sat up slowly, wincing at stiff muscles. "You did what needed doing, McNasty." "I was scared," McNiece said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Whole time I was scared. Mapes was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Anyone who says they weren't is lying. Difference is, you stayed scared and did it anyway. McNiece looked down at the Johnson rifle, scratched and mud-caked, a weapon that wasn't supposed to be there, used by a man who wasn't supposed to make it. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess that's the difference. Part 6. 60 days later, McNiece was back in England, waiting for the next jump. Operation Market Garden loomed on the horizon, and the Filthy 13 were being briefed on objectives in Holland. Bridges, roads and river crossings that would once again require improvisation, stubbornness, and the willingness to hold positions that doctrine said couldn't be held. The Johnson M1941 was gone, returned to supply or lost in the shuffle of Normandy's aftermath. McNiece carried a Thompson now, the familiar weight of a submachine gun that matched his role as a demolition NCO better than a scavenged rifle ever could. But he still thought about it. The unfamiliar heft, the rotary magazine, the way it had cycled smoothly when everything else was chaos. Most of all, he thought about what it represented, the improvisation that kept men alive when plans failed, when drops scattered across enemy territory, when the only choice was between adapting or dying. Private Kowalski found him in the mess hall, looking more confident than the frightened replacement who'd frozen in his first firefight. The kid sat down without asking. "Heard we're jumping into Holland soon," Kowalski said. McNiece nodded. "Heard right. You think it'll be like Normandy?" McNiece considered the question. The honest answer was that every jump would be like Normandy in the ways that mattered. Chaos, fear, improvisation, and the brutal calculus of who lived and who didn't. But he could also see that Kowalski was asking something else, whether they'd survive, whether McNiece's stubborn adaptability could get them through another impossible situation. "It'll be different," McNiece said finally. "But some things stay the same. We'll figure it out." Kowalski nodded, seeming reassured by the confidence McNiece didn't entirely feel. Years later, long after Holland, after Bastogne, after the war ended, and the Filthy 13 became stories told in books and documentaries, McNiece would think about that day in the Normandy hedgerows. The official citation credited him with adaptive resolve under fire, sanitizing the terror and chaos into something clean and presentable. But McNiece remembered the truth. He remembered the weight of the Johnson rifle in shaking hands. He remembered the certainty of death and the thin margin of survival. Most of all, he remembered the faces of 18 men who'd made it to the tree line because someone had stayed behind. Not out of courage, but out of the stubborn inability to do anything else. The legend said Jake McNiece held off a German patrol with a scavenged rifle and fearless improvisation. The reality was a terrified NCO with unfamiliar equipment, gambling that 10 rounds and semi-automatic fire would buy enough seconds for his men to escape. The legend was lighter, easier to carry. The reality lived in his hands, in the way he'd check magazines twice before combat, in the nightmares where he ran out of ammunition and the Germans kept coming. He carried both, the legend others told and the memory he lived with. Because that was what it meant to survive, learning to hold the weight of what actually happened while the world around you compressed it into something simpler, cleaner, more heroic than the truth could ever be. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.